Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome. Good morning, Frankfurt. We'd like to take the opportunity that we're 1 hour ahead of London, and we want to make the very best of that early hour in the morning. It's my pleasure to warmly welcome all of you to the 23rd Financial Center breakfast. It's the 8 times that will have it as a virtual food for thought breakfast. And I'm very happy to warmly welcome Dr. Cornelia Meyer of Meyer Resources on the topic of the US election and its impact on the energy, particularly the oil markets. On that very occasion, I would also like to warmly welcome the new president of Frankfurt Main Finance, Gerhard Wiesoy, who would like to address you at the start of the meeting today. Before that, please allow me to also thank our long-term partner, the Association of Foreign Banks in Frankfurt, with whom we have been working all those years. So I would kindly ask for, before I introduce Cornelia Meyer with a little bit more detail, Gerhard Wiesoy to address you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to take this opportunity to welcome you all to Food for Thought seminar today. I think it's a wonderful opportunity to get together, to exchange views, to strengthen the ecosystem over here. Well, I took over the presidency of Frankfurt Main Finance a few weeks ago from Dr. Lutz Rettich, who was in the lead for over 12 years now. And I'm very much looking forward to further promote Frankfurt as the financial center, together with a very good team, with Hubertus Feth, with Mr. Glenzel, and the rest of the team is, I must say, a very good support for this presidency. Well, we are all now just in front of Brexit, as we know. It will come, now it has to come. All grace periods are over, and you all know that the horse race has started a few years ago already about who is taking the lead as a financial center in continental Europe. And I think Frankfurt has a very good position to take this role. And I think it just started again, and we all have to make much efforts to really sharpen the position and to further promote Frankfurt as the financial center. For this reason, I'm very thrilled and optimistic what we can do for Frankfurt. And I think we have a lot of assets here. We have to bring the people together. And in this context, I think this format, this breakfast meeting here early in the morning is a wonderful opportunity to again bring people together. Well, I just wanted to say hello to you, and I'm looking forward very much to the opinion and the speech of Dr. Meyer. I think it's a wonderful opportunity to get an insight in the further development of oil, or let's say how important oil will be in the future. As we all know, we are moving towards renewable energy. And for that reason, I'm really very happy that I can join this meeting today. Again, thank you very much for joining to all of you today. And I wish you all a very nice and joyful Christmas time, and please stay safe. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gerhard Wiesoy. It's we're very glad to have you as our new president, and we know that we will have the full support of you, particularly also on the international stage. We're very proud to have you on board. So thank you very much for the address. We also feel very privileged to have Dr. Cornelia Meyer today as a speaker. She's very well known in the Middle East. She's very well known in the UK. She's a very regular commentator on BBC, on CNN, and on the various Middle Eastern media. She's had a long history as a macroeconomist and as Oxford Energy Policy member. speaker. She advises governments, multilateral organizations such as OPEC on matters, on energy matters. She's been working in the energy field for many years, amongst others, even in the exploration area in the deep east of Russia. Though not many ladies venture that far in the energy sector. The impact of the US election on energy markets is our issue today. The designated, elected new president, Mr. Biden, has announced a 4-year and $2 trillion climate plan to become carbon-free by electricity production in 2035. He wants to build the infrastructure and make clean energy the core of that. How, Cornelia Meyer, does that impact the energy markets, one of the biggest markets in the world? We'll have about 25 to 30 minutes of presentation and speech by Cornelia. Please take the opportunity to raise your questions. You have in the bottom bar the opportunity. Let me tell you that also the presentation and the entire speech is going to be recorded and displayed on our website. And do not hesitate to use our hashtags at FMF Digital, Virtual Food for Thought, and also hashtag Cornelia Meyer. I'm very much looking forward to your presentation, Cornelia. The floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody, and good morning, Mr. Fed. Good morning, Mr. Wieshoy. Good morning, Mr. Glenzel, and of course, all the esteemed participants. It's a great honor for me to be with you today. About a topic that's close to my heart. And I'm going to go a little bit further than just oil. I'm going to look a lot at electricity because that's where it's at, and at ESG and how realistic things are. May I now ask and also it's a huge privilege, of course, to be with you. May I ask the maestro of the slides to bring up the first slide, please? Okay, this is the first slide, the title. Do you know that? I'm sitting in Switzerland, not in London. I'm a UK national and a Swiss national. Sadly, no longer a EU national, which is very sad for me. And I applaud Mr. Fed for his great efforts on stealing business from us in London. Anyhow, first slide, please. Let me just quickly tell you what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the world that is, and then we're going to talk about the global consensus around net zero, and then several views on that, because it's not as straightforward as it looks. We're going to look at financial ramifications, which are quite dire, which are quite great for some companies and quite dire for others. We're going to look at ESG, and when I look at the Biden administration, it will clearly bring the consensus around net zero further. There will be more pressure on it. It will also be more mainstream because the current situation made it a bit crazy. But the train has left the station, and what Biden does is enforce that train and maybe give it some speed. Next slide, please. The world as is. Here we look at the CO2 emissions, and we can see in 2019, we can see the dark blue. It is about Russia, China, India, the EU together. These four entities emit 64% of CO2. So this is clearly important. Next slide, please. And here we see how this is composed. I mean, who uses the primary, how the major users of energy, and we see how important electricity is. And that is precisely why we have this push towards, and it would become more important with electrification, but that's precisely why we have this push to renewables. And let me add here, it is not about oil. Oil is really used very rarely these days for electricity generation. It's about gas versus renewables versus nuclear and so on. Next slide, please. Here we see the traditional view. OPEC, which is traditional, obviously, and has vested interest in oil, it's after all the Organization of Oil Exporting Countries, sees that by 2045 we still have about 25% of energy consumption in oil. We still have about between 60 and 70% of primary energy consumption in carbon-based energy sources, coal, gas, and oil. Next slide, please. As I said before, we have this global consensus about around net zero, and that train has left the station. I don't know whether any of you have seen the excellent BBC 1 hour special with Antonio Guterres, where he talks about the planet being in crisis. It was all a bit dramatic, but it just was very good to highlight where a lot of the popular thought is. Next slide, please. We have a new world order, and the new world order started 2015 with the Paris Agreement, which was first 2 degrees. Now we say in order to stop the warming of the planet, we need to be 1.5 degrees by end of the century above pre-industrial levels. The hook that cleverly that the Paris Agreement has, it has finance. It has the thing that finance needs to be consistent with these goals, and that's why we see the former governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, who has taken the role of climate and finance for the UN. But one thing that's important also in the agreement is its national contribution. There's no edict from the UN. The UN can advise, UNFCCC can advise, can guide, but there's no edict. But there's a real momentum. We by now have more than 100 countries. We have 22 regions, 452 cities, 1,100 big companies who say that they want to have net zero by 2050, and more than 45 of the major financial institutions say they're working towards that end. But then when I look at the investment portfolios, there's still a lot of carbon in there. We have a huge push from the civil society, and that's what I call the Greta effect. But we need to be clear that there's still some major emitters: Brazil, Russia, India. By the way, India, Brazil. India emits about 5% of CO2, and Russia about 7% of CO2, and Australia have not yet signed up. They all have rather conservative governments, and obviously India uses a lot of coal-fired power plants, and Australia is a lot about exporting coal to China when they're not fighting with China. Then we have, how are we going to achieve this? We have energy transition policies. We have taxation. And actually, Mr. Guterres said we should no longer be taxed on income. We should be taxed on CO2 emissions. I don't know what that means for me. You can think what that all would mean for you. Not very realistic, but that's where we go. We have various methodologies, more renewables. There's a tremendous push for renewables, especially in electricity generation. We are moving away, and I have a very powerful slide in the first world, and I reiterate, in the first world, from the combustion engine. And the thing is, that's very important for Germany, because clearly your car industry has to adjust to that, and its survival lies very much in how they adjust to it. Then we have CCUS, carbon capture, usage and storage. We have the Saudis, who also have a vested interest as the biggest exporter of oil, have this circular carbon economy, wants to reuse, reduce, recycle, and remove CO2. And we have obviously smart buildings and so on. Now, what's largely overlooked here, though, is 2 things. How are we going to ensure compliance? Because it's easy for me to say as an investor, I only invest on this. It's easy for me as a company to say I'm doing X. and not do it. So the thing of, there's a big issue about compliance. There's also a big issue around something that we haven't thought through yet, because it's just been too fast, but we need to think through. That is the full life cycle assessment for any use and source of energy of both the environmental impact, CO2 emissions, and also what that means financially. And one example, if we look at, for instance, EVs, electric vehicles, it's great to say, yes, they emit less if the power source is also nice and clean. But very few people think that it takes 23 kilograms of copper to produce your average combustion engine car, but 75 kilograms of copper to produce that EV. That the batteries are have highly toxic substances. So how are we going to decommission? We need to look at EVs through the same lens as we look at nuclear power plants, where decommissioning is also one of the issues. So what can I say? Race to net zero, and the train, as I said, has left the station. Groundswell in civil society, multilaterals have gone on to it. Look at the European Investment Bank, who says they will no longer finance even gas. And when these leaders, like a multilateral development bank, like an EIB, says they're no longer financing gas, the big banks will follow. So then we have governments, we have corporates, and finance really is the transmission mechanism here. Look at ESG. Next slide, please. United States, well, we have the Paris Accord, and without President Obama in 2015, we would never at COP21 have gotten to the Paris Accord. He went in and negotiated with the countries that were sitting on the border. So he used the might of his country. Then we have the 2017, President Donald Trump announces he wants to leave the Paris Accord, and you can, once you announce you want to withdraw, a year later you can physically withdraw, which happened on the 9th of November. But when we look at CO2 emissions, that's again where I would urge you to look a little bit closer. The US has gone minus 3% of CO2 emissions in 2019, minus 1.1% from 2008 and 2018, and that's thanks to shale gas. Then you look at Germany. So sorry to be mean to you as you are in Germany, but you went up 9.9% between 2014 and 2016. That is when you started the policy of phasing out nuclear, as we did in Switzerland, and it was substituted with coal. So sometimes truly the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Not saying that Germany is on the way to hell. The US, and when I look at the US, it's not just the reason that it didn't have such a big impact. It's not just about the federal state. It's about the states, and it's about the regions, and it's about the cities. I don't know how many of you were at COP23 in Bonn in 2017, where we just had Trump announced that he wanted to leave Paris, and you had sort of alternate Americas. You had the America of the Trump administration, who had presentations on why coal was good for the environment, which I thought was rather interesting. I was there. And then you had former Mayor Bloomberg and the governor of California, and these people saying, no, we really need to work towards net zero. We really need to address this. So as we have a federal state, a lot of these things don't happen at the national level, but at the state, municipal, and regional levels. Now, the Biden administration, they're serious. They will rejoin. The first act, like Donald Trump left the TPP, Biden will rejoin the Paris Accord. When you look at the personnel choices, it says John Kerry, a former Secretary of State, with huge influence, is going to be the climate czar. Even maybe more important, Brian Deese, director of the National Economic Council, the chief economic advisor, is the man, he's coming from BlackRock, is the man who helped President Obama pulled together Paris. So this is really front and center. And I'm not going to reuse the statistics that Hubertus just gave us, because there's going to be a huge push, and especially when you look at all the rescue package, at the investment that is going, Biden is going to make sure that flows into the climate agenda. And there's another thing which is important for the oil industry. The $40 put for shale that you had under President Trump. Remember last April when oil went negative, WTI went negative for about 24 hours. Trump used his muscle to get OPEC and their 10 allies under OPEC Plus to come up with historic production cuts. So that put isn't there anymore. And that will also focus for OPEC. It's different. On one hand, they will see more consistency, which they will welcome. But on the other hand, that counterforce from Trump was not bad to focus their cohesion. So the US will be a lead partner in the climate change agenda. And Biden is a multilateralist, so expect him to work with, especially with the EU, but also with Japan and other nations towards achieving the climate goals. So there will be more rationale behind the madness with Biden. There will be a bigger push, but again, the train has left the station. He will impact it. He will emphasize it, but the train has left the station. Next slide, please. And now let's look at the various views around the consensus around oil, which is quite interesting. Next slide, please. You see that various organizations look at the, depending on where they come from, look at the, when we have peak oil differently. You see the peak in 20. Oh, there's something happened there when with the slide. Anyhow, you see the peak for Rystad in 2022, in 2030, 2035 for Bloomberg New Energy Finance. Wood Mackenzie is 2035, and OPEC sees it just 2045, depending on where they come from. There's no consensus, but we all see the peak oil demand between 5 and 25 years from now. It's quite a big thing. Next, please. Then look at BP. BP, an oil company who now wants to become a renewables company. In the vein, when I was at BP, Lloyd Brown was the head, and he was very much in that vein. But they see 2019 as the peak for oil demand, and they see in a business as usual scenario, it's sort of to taper off slowly. In a net zero by 2050 scenario to go, as you see, and in a net zero by 2040 scenario to even drastically decrease. So a peak oil demand, according to BP, a big oil major is behind us. Next slide, please. And, you know, in order to achieve that, we need to have massive electrification, and oil consumption will go down. So in order to get to net zero, and in order to achieve, it may not be net zero, but maybe just to achieve some of the climate goals, electrification is very important. Next slide, please. This is just, I brought this in last year. Last year, BP, you can see peak oil was somewhere in around, was much later last year than where it is now. So BP has really changed around within the span of 12 months its outlook. Next slide, please. And this is what it means. Some of these companies have new installed capacity, which went up by, the new installed capacity recently went up over the last few years by 207% for renewable energy. And you see Chinese, you see Berkshire Hathaway, all of them very aggressively going there. So the utilities are really looking at how they can go there. Now, some of them also look at, which is interesting, there's a big divide for nuclear. There's a big divide. Some countries like the UK want nuclear, the Middle Eastern countries want nuclear. And if you talk to EDF, they believe, I was just recently at one of these things with EDF, they believe in nuclear, but again, here they don't. And I think to a certain degree, Germany and Switzerland are right in phasing them out, maybe not that quickly, but because really the decommissioning has not been solved. And these things are with us for many, many, many generations, the nuclear waste. Next slide, please. And here, just the electrification, what that means. You see here, the green is the new electric vehicles and the fuel cell. And you see how the demand for internal combustion engine goes down in cars. Now, to me, this is a nice slide. It's from Bloomberg New Energy Finances, based on Bloomberg New Energy Finances statistics. But to me, this is a first world story, because yeah, in China, they can do this because it's a centrally planned economy and they will get there. But mind you, in China also, with COVID-19 and the economy not doing so well, they became much less aggressive on substituting for coal-fired power plants. And we have many, many more coal-fired power plants now. So we have to be, again, careful. Do countries walk the talk? But if you're India, you're just not going to get your act together to get to these numbers. And let's look at real developing countries in Africa. They have growing middle classes. These middle classes want to drive cars, and while they may think they may be very affected by climate change, when it then comes to put your family in a car, well, if the affordable option is a combustion engine car, then you'll go with that. And especially if the infrastructure isn't there, in many of these countries, you have load shedding or brownouts or blackouts or whatever, depending on the country, for hours and hours and hours on end. And if you have that, how are you going to recharge your vehicle? Next slide, please. All of that we've seen now has huge financial ramifications. Next slide, please. Let's look at oil companies. They had big write-downs. I've put this up in halves, and you see whenever the oil price went down, the write-downs on their balance sheets went down. This year, first half alone, $170 billion. I mean, that's the oil majors, but that's more than 50 billion a pop. So that's serious. Next slide, please. And this slide is one of my favorite slides because it shows us how the world has changed. We see the black lines are the oil companies, the oil majors, the big oil companies. The blue ones are the renewables champions in their countries. And I think the story tells it all in terms of market cap. Funding, and that's precisely where Paris is so clever. Funding goes towards the ESG, the environmentally, social, and governance investment, and it's very hard for oil companies these days to get financed. As I said, when you look at the decisions by places like the World Bank, the European Investment Bank, other multilaterals, it's harder to find finance. It's becoming more expensive. Also, if you want to have a loan, it's becoming more difficult because the chairman and the CEO of your bank will have been sent letters by their grandchildren and Greta Thunberg that they shouldn't kill the planet. And it's just the pressure not to finance, high carbon emitting things is very important. I sometimes feel I'm in different worlds. When I'm at OPEC, we talk about oil all the time. Then I was at the B20, the virtual business 20 summit for the G20, which was hosted by Saudi Arabia. Day one, we had the CEO of the president of the European Investment Bank telling us how we had to get to net zero. Nobody should use any oil, which I thought was rather interesting, given that it was in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia hosting the event. And then the next day, we had the Minister of His Royal Highness Prince Abdulaziz bin Salman, the Minister of Energy for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, telling us all about the circular carbon economy and how reusing, removing, etc. of carbon was a good thing and could save a lot. So the truth is somewhere in between, and I just wished that both sides listened a bit more to the other. I feel that the oil side is really listening actually to the demands of the climate enthusiasts. I feel that the climate enthusiasts are not really listening when it comes to CCUS or the circular carbon economy. Next, please. Now, again, it's as a boss of mine when I worked for GE once said, when I told him how wonderful it was, how I loved the oil industry and how it was such an interesting sector, he said, it's just money. And it all boils, he's right, it all boils to money. ESG shapes investment patterns. Next slide, please. When we look at right now, ESG investment is at $40.5 trillion. It's up 20% in, it's up 200% in 4 years and 300% in 8 years. The 30 biggest money managers have increased their staff on ESG investment by 229% since 2017. Active strategies are preferred. I just still wonder how these good meaning investors really look into the supply chain and everything. But you also see companies, you see Nestle just earmarking 3.5 billion for environmental causes. You see many companies really jumping on that bandwagon, and they need to if they want to raise funds. Deloitte says that the potential for ESG investments in the US to grow is 300% between now and 2025 in 5 years. That is huge. That is, if they've ever seen a growth industry, it's this. But again, how are they measuring it? So 50% of professionally managed money will use these guidelines. My issue with ESG is how are they really seeing, how are they really finding that the companies walk the talk? Because they're, I used to work for BP when we said we were so environmentally friendly, and some things were not so environmentally friendly. Then the other thing is the S is often falling away, the social impact. We are so focused on climate that we sometimes forget about social ramifications. Allow me to give you an example. I was on a panel at the beginning of the year when we still could have live conferences at the big banking conference in Switzerland with the head of Ethos, which is a firm which is on the board of many of the companies looking at ESG compliance. And I had to tell the man when he said everybody should now no longer use gas or oil-fired power stations, everything should be geothermal. I had to say, well, what about the pensioner who has been let's say a worker somewhere in a manufacturing company who has a little house, a very small pension, all he basically has the house. So you ask him now to invest 50,000, he's 75 years old, 50,000 Swiss francs. He doesn't have that money. If 75 years old, he can't get a loan. He can't get a mortgage. So do you want him to freeze? Do you want him not to eat anymore? Or do you want him to move outside into a tent because he can't use his house anymore? So these are the things that we really need to think about. And yes, the climate is important, but we do need to consider the social ramifications. And I feel that gets lost. And I'm very interested to see, because Biden, as being a Democrat, has to look at these ramifications. He has to talk to trade unions who will tell him, yes, we love looking after the environment, but this is what it means for our workers financially. So I'm interested to see how he will tackle that and whether he will come up with creative mechanisms to reconcile those two, the E and the S. So ESG is where it's at. Only how do we ensure compliance, and how do we ensure we can calibrate between the various demands? It's not that straightforward. Next slide, please. Here, I just wanted to show you. This is what Deloitte says. Deloitte says 50%, and I thought it was a nice thing. 50% of this will be in of professionally managed money. It will go into ESG. Again, definition of ESG, how to enforce. Next slide, please. Conclusion. Oh, we're there. Hey, next slide, please. The conundrum that we all face is how to achieve climate goals and provide affordable energy for all. And I'm not just talking rich people who are sitting here in rich countries. I'm talking, the peasant farmer in Somalia. I'm talking the really poor. I do a lot of work with the Islamic Development Bank, so I'm faced basically on a daily basis with these things. Then, net zero is the new global consensus. How we get there may not be the consensus, and it's easy to have a lofty goal. How to get there without snags is a different one, and I would really, really encourage our politicians to look at also a full life cycle assessment. But this new world has obviously huge ramifications for valuations and investing, as we have seen. Holding oil company shares may not be the thing of the future. So ESG. We need to address the issues, as I've said, and I'm very big proponent of full life cycle assessment. Now, the Biden administration will drive the consensus further. It will drive international cooperation. It may come up with good mechanisms in country of reconciling the E with the S, so the environment with the social impact. But it's the train has left the station. I hope that I have great hopes that the new administration will bring a little bit of moderation and a just more professional approach to this debate, because with Trump it was just getting it was just too dictonomous. So great hopes, but it's a difficult scenario, which you're all bankers, has real impact on how you invest and where you invest. With that, I'm handing back to Hubertus.
Yeah, Cornelia, thank you very much for that interesting ride across the entire energy landscape and environmental impacts, price impacts, political dimensions. So Cornelia, we have the first questions. The first one you've answered already during your conversation. It was about nuclear energy and how the various approaches could be eventually reconciled under ESG. But there is another quick question which you didn't touch upon. There was a big part of U.S. policy becoming more energy independent to support the shale gas industry, and that basically has changed the landscape. That made the U.S. the biggest oil producer in the world, following Saudi Arabia and probably Russia. So what will happen to shale industry? Will that be starved of investment? Will we see that energy shrink tremendously, or how would the U.S. balance its geostrategical objective to be energy independent on the one hand side and to be carbon neutral on the other?
Well, I think Biden isn't not as fussed about energy independence as Donald Trump was. Now we have to say that this shale industry, shale gas, helped reduce the CO2 emissions in the US, because a lot of the electricity generation went from coal to gas. So in that sense, as a transition fuel, Biden will have to see shale gas or gas as a transition fuel, because simply there are too many jobs dependent on that industry. But as I said, there will no longer be the put. Trump made sure that the oil price would not go below a certain level. And the shale industry, these are smaller, now bigger, because a lot of the super majors have bought into the shale space. But they have less wherewithal. They're more highly geared. They have less wherewithal than other upstream giants. But the Exxons and so on, as I said, the Shells have bought into the shale space. So yes, we will see less production out of the US. The US certainly has reached the peak of its hydrocarbon production. But mine's hands are a little bit tied. But if I want to say it this way, right now I would not want to be a shale producer.
Okay, not a comfortable place to be. You mentioned rightly that besides the global consensus, you'd see Russia, you'd see India, you see Brazil, to just name the three biggest of which. Do you foresee them moving more towards the consensus under Biden?
Under Biden, they will have to. I mean, Russia will have to. Russia will have big standoffs. Russia is another place where I wouldn't want to be right now. I would not want to be Vladimir Putin right now because for him also it's going to get less comfortable under Biden than under Trump, and he will have to. There will be horse trading and adhering more to the climate goals is he may do, especially when you look at what's happening with the permafrost in Siberia. And having huge wildfires in Siberia, and the methane emissions, that must worry him, because that does affect his country. So I see them moving. Brazil will have to move, but I have an anecdote again. I was at the Future Investment Initiative in Riyadh last year, about this time last year, and Jair Bolsonaro spoke, and he basically told us all that these were his rainforests, and if he wanted to cut them down, it was in his purview. And we should all shut up. So he will have his work cut out for him. But again, here, I think they will move there. For India, it's harder, because how do they get there? If they still have energy, they still have a lot of people. The grid is not really there. They have a lot of people not connected to the grid. They are using a lot of coal, and they don't see how they get around coal. And they have very ambitious targets with concerning EVs. But so far, I think they have something like 200 filling stations for EVs.
Yeah, charging
so
stations.
I don't see them to get there.
Yeah. So what would your place to be look like in these days?
Yeah, my place to be would be probably, I would invest, if I had to invest, I would invest into the new brave renewables champions, because they get there. But I'm really concerned, what really concerns me is, again, do countries walk the talk? When I see China telling me that we want to be net zero before 2060, it's laudable, it's great, I'm for it. But when I then see that because of the pandemic, that we get more coal-fired power stations and CO2 emissions go up, it's very difficult. It's always difficult to say where you want to be. This is not just a change. These are tectonic shifts of how we look at how we consume our energy and where we produce our energy. But my bet would be on my bet would be on the Berkshire Hathaways, who tend to have a good glimpse of who will sort of survive the best. But let us be very clear. This new world will create a lot of value, and it will destroy a lot of value, and some of it is by the roll of the dice.
I actually would have expected an answer from your side. You would want to be in the space of the carbon cycle economy, because that's obviously something that is being promoted by oil producing companies, and it obviously entails something which is pretty controversial. Is there something like carbon capture? Once you release it, can you capture it again? Can you bury it? There is supposed to be a project between Japan and Australia to massively bury carbon under the sea. Is that sort of a distortion, or is that actually a pretty viable solution, which we haven't been thinking about enough?
It's a viable, I think it's viable, and that's where I'm a big fan of the circular carbon economy, because it really looks not just the capture, it looks at also at the whole value chain, so to say, of carbon. However, I think it's a little bit too early, and I have been badly burnt. When I was at BP, we were given a subsidy for a huge carbon capture project, a CCS project in the North Sea, and by the time we had poured in 2 billion, the subsidy went. So when I see governments being consistent in their policies towards carbon capture to get us over the hump of making it affordable, I'm for it. I would work on it. I would work on it in, let's say, in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, where the circular carbon economy has the government push, and they will be consistent about it. You know, the brother of the king, the brother of the crown prince suggested it, so they will be consistent about it. But it could become very interesting. But at this point, I would see it as a risk investment. A little bit of money in it, but not too much, because we still need, you know, as always, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. And so far, I haven't seen many nice meals dished up here.
Talking about consistency, carbon tax has actually been on the agenda for 30 years. I remember my university days when those ideas were raised, and it obviously took quite a while before they became common sense. And it appears that with lots of exceptions and all that, carbon taxing has not been very efficient in really reducing it. Do I miss something, or is it something which we'll probably see in the next future?
You're totally not missing anything. Carbon tax only works if it's universal. If it's the same carbon tax in Germany as in Switzerland, as in Japan, as in Russia. Otherwise, there's just so many ways around it. And that's, oddly enough, that is where the Biden administration could get somewhere. Like Obama really got us there on the Paris Accord. Biden could get us there on carbon tax via the UNFCCC. The only issue there again is, if you read the Paris Agreement, implementation of the goals rests with the various countries. So there's that much, there's that much muscle that the US has with certain countries, not with others. But again, carbon tax only works if everybody looks at it, and especially the big emitters. So we would need the EU, that's easy. We would need the US, we could get there, but we would need Russia, India also in there, and we would need China in there, and that's going to be, and China is the big one, because 28% of CO2 emissions hail from China. So that's going to be the big one.
That's going to be a big one, but let's move a little bit closer to home, to the EU. The EU is, so to say, preparing its sustainability program. What are your views on it? Are they on target? Is there some more work to do?
I think there may be more. There may be more work to do. It's very aspirational, and that's the problem with the whole net zero debate. It's very aspirational. And again, I would urge the EU, and I would urge the national politicians, when they look at the various sources and uses of energy, really to look at the full life cycle, and in terms of environmental impact, and in terms of finance, because you may, via finance, find a way of getting to the right point. But right now we just all say, oh, EV is wonderful, they will emit less. Fine. But, what about decommissioning? What about, you know, getting rid of our old stock? What about decommissioning of solar panels? We haven't thought this through. So I would like to see. That's, I know I'm in a, it's close to Christmas. I'm having Christmas wish. I know I won't get my, you never get the toy you want. I won't get my Christmas wish here, but I would really like us to have a more differentiated approach, and also to look at the social impacts. Now, one of the things we have is, because we so quickly decide on things, and the shutting in the nuclear power plants in Switzerland and Germany is just a big example. Excuse me. But we do something, and then we suddenly wake up and say, oh my God, but this has an effect here. So we really need to look at the whole value chain.
Mm-hmm. As you rightly said, we are approaching the festive season, and it's always a time to look back. And with your decades of experience, where would you say, where has human mankind missed a big opportunity to get it right? Because as you pointed out, our children, our grandchildren, they rightly ask us, I mean, what did you do to the planet? I mean, we'll inhabit it, and we'll hopefully inhabit it for many generations, but what did you do to it? And there's been talk about environmental matters for decades. When you look back, and with hindsight, where were the big opportunities missed, and what to learn about those opportunities missed going forward?
Thank you. We should have thought about the CO2 emission conundrum much earlier. We also, but let's not forget, yes, this was very bad for the environment. The most, you know, most of the warming, most of the CO2 emissions came after 1975. And I will never forget Jimmy Carter sitting in his sweater and in his pullover in a chair, telling us after the first oil shock that we, in 1973, that we all needed to now have, you know, heatless. But we should have invested. We should have invested earlier. We should have focused earlier. But let us not forget that that single focus on growth has helped lift millions, hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. China is a big example. So we will need to clean up the act, yes, but we should not throw the baby out with the bathwater. We should, yes, we have not acted fast enough, probably, but we should not forget that it's easy for us sitting in Frankfurt and Bern to say, oh, we should have thought earlier, because we grew up, we could go to school, we had electric light, we had everything. If you were somewhere in northern rural China, northeastern rural China, or northwestern rural China, life was not a nice place to be, and it's a much better place now.
And I suppose that conflict will even get starker with COVID. I mean, if you look at the data from World Bank, hundreds of millions pushed below the poverty line, that basically a decade of people being lifted out of poverty has been erased by the virus. So how can it be reconciled, those two objectives? Because I certainly, it should not be at the expense of the poorest of the poor, should it?
Yes, it shouldn't be. And I think they're again, investing in clean energy sources is a good thing. Having infrastructure programs that more look that within the reason of what is possible, look at having them as carbon friendly as possible. I'm not saying carbon neutral, because if I have to construct a road somewhere in the deepest, darkest Africa, it's just not gonna be as easy as if I'm constructing a road from Bern to Zurich. That's just or from Manchester to Birmingham. So I think that's it. We should have the perspective. We should aim high, try to get there, but do it within reason. But if we get the funds, these are huge funds that have been spoken for pandemic relief. If we get these rescue packages spent on the right things, and especially also there, the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank and the Islamic Development Bank and so on are very, very important. If we get them spent on the right things, we can get there. But we should also, I always say, we should do things in a measured way, because if you go too fast down some road and then suddenly find that, oops, now we have spent 300 million or 1 trillion, and actually it was counterproductive. That's not good. We should think things through. I know that's not something politicians like to do, because their life has a 4-year cycle of elections. It's not necessarily what bankers want to do, because their next bonus that's sort of a yearly cycle. The quarterly results is a quarterly cycle. But I would urge us to think a little bit more long term and really think things through.
If that were not be the perfect wish for the next year, to think a little bit more long term, Cornelia, it's been a delight. Thank you very much. We're at the end of our session. It's the last session for quite a remarkable year, 2020. I wish all of you, and you foremost, Cornelia, a very Merry Christmas, a very happy festive season. All of us taking the opportunity to lean back and think things through, think things a little longer term, and first and foremost, stay healthy, and hope to see you soon in 2021. Thanks very much for joining us this morning.
Thank you very much for having me, Hubertus. It's been a great honor and really a pleasure, and I admire very much what you're achieving with FMF Finance.
Thank you, Cornelia. See you soon.
See you soon.